Now making the change across to a green future. I mean, Nicola talks very well about the fact that Scotland could be leading in the move from the oil era to the green one, but actually we're still drilling. Now, the folk that you want to talk to, who you want to discuss that with, you can try and discuss it with England. They're not interested. They're building nuclear power stations as long as they can get the French and the Chinese to cough up the money, because the City of London recognises it's a really bad deal. Despite having the longest lease periods, despite the biggest subsidies, no one wants to touch nuclear. But that's the kind of, effectively almost puerile debate that we're in energy terms in Britain. Take it wider, and you get a completely different look at that same situation. The Lofoten Islands in Norway, exactly the same problem. They are the spawning ground of 70% of the fish in the northern seas. Should they be drilling for oil there? They're pretty confident there's huge reserves. Well, we might all get up on our high horses and say, no, 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 they shouldn't be doing that. What about us? The Icelanders, a bit the same. They have geothermal energy. They use that to power everything. They get such cheap energy from it that they take all the dirty industries in, like aluminium. Will they stop doing that? Probably not. They have the same dilemma as us because they are energy-based economies. We are. We would be if we had control of energy because we could decide what we were connecting up. As it is, the islands that have got the best wind capacity and the emerging marine capacity still don't have cables to the mainland. And this is 20 years we've been talking about this. Meanwhile, little islands that have much, much less take from the wind in Denmark have got 2 1 gigawatt cables in that period. We are so chronically underinvested in here. So that's maybe one future for us, is fitting in with the halfway house kids, and it's not a bad one. I mean, just coming back to Iceland, last year I ran a group called Nordic Horizons. It took a lot of people over from each Nordic country to sort of hear how they had dealt with their relations with Europe. Well, the guy who came from Iceland was a chap called Jon Balvin Hannibalsson. I didn't know much about him before he came. He was a pretty stirring speaker, and afterwards we decided to make this little book, Smorgasbord, about each of the different countries' experiences, and actually it's like a little guide to the Nordics. So I sort of researched each speaker because I thought, you'll know Ken, these folk, you need a little bit of fluffing up. And I discovered something really quite remarkable about Jon Balvin. In 1991, Lithuania declared independence. And within about 5 days, there were 14 people dead at the TV station, trying to protect it from tanks that had rolled in from the Soviet direction. And nobody, this might sound familiar to you, thinking about Catalonia, nobody would recognise Lithuania. Nobody wanted to antagonise the Russians. Quite evidently, the West had decided it was better to be dealing with the devil you know, Yeltsin and co, than the possibility they would go back to communism. So they were prepared to overlook some wee transgressions at Lithuania's occupation. But a wee guy got on a plane in Reykjavik, flew to Vilnius, got out, went into the middle of all this melee, and on behalf of the people of Iceland, Jon Balvin Hannibalsson formally recognised Lithuania as an independent country. And that stopped the rot. That one action stopped the slide. And within a couple of weeks, there was 4 other countries recognised Lithuania, and within a year, it was a member of the United Nations. And when the same thing happened in Estonia and Latvia, on each occasion, the first guy in, same again, Jon Balvin. Iceland was the first country to recognise the independence of each Baltic state. And that's extraordinary, isn't it? Because here's Iceland, population 250,000 at the time. You know, 300,000 now. In history, there have never been more than 1 million Icelanders, ever. But those guys know how to put all their clout on one square when they need to. I couldn't believe I'd been sitting next to this guy. He's a blinking hero, and I hadn't even known him. Nobody had said anything about it. So I asked him, and I said, what was it made you think that you guys could intervene like this? And he said, well, you know, we thought about it and we realised the West didn't care because it was playing big geopolitics. But actually, they were wrong. They were morally wrong. They were wrong for small countries because we need other small countries in the world like us. Small countries are buffers against these dangerous big nations. And we decided that somebody would have to act. Why shouldn't it be Iceland? Glory be for the Icelanders. And half their DNA is Celtic. The female half. So the thing is, that's the kind of, these are our neighbours. These people we share DNA with. You know, this is the kind of approach that independent-minded nations take because they know they can act, they know they need to act. So there's Iceland, there's Norway. The Norwegians, again, although they're not in the EU, huge believers in Europe. You may know that Norway was occupied by Germany during the Second World War. When the Germans finally left, all the political parties in Norway stood on the same manifesto in the elections in 1945. I mean, what an extraordinary thing. A lot of people said that Norway became independent in 1905, but it didn't know what that was for until 1945, when there was this incredible sense of national purpose. And after that, as again you may know, they had social democratic governments that transformed Norway from the second poorest country in Europe after Portugal to the world's most wealthy country per head of the population, with its sovereign wealth fund that we can only stand back and wish and imagine. And some of the reasons that Norway embarked on that, well, that's sad for us too, actually. Things tend to follow templates in life. And the reason that the Norwegians effectively kept public ownership of their oil wealth is because they had done that already with the first kind of wealth they got, which was hydroelectric power. When Norway became independent in 1905, it discovered that all its big rivers had actually been bought up mostly by English industrialists. And it just really realised, I mean, the rivers were pivotal for them. It was going to produce all their energy. It was also how they got all their timber out. So they realised they couldn't have that. So they basically nationalised the rivers. They took that back. And the outlook they had was, from that moment on, that hydroelectricity was something that was a community asset. It didn't belong to the guy that had the river. And of course, there really isn't feudal land ownership in Norway, so that was kind of easy. So the profits of hydropower came to the state, but more than that, it came to the local state. The money came right back to the municipalities that the hydro dams were in. And these municipalities are small, unlike Scotland. There are 429 councils in Norway. There are 32 councils in Scotland. We each have 5 million folk. So this is a powerful, powerful municipalism in Norway, which rests on the money they got from hydroelectricity, which rests on the fact that it was not allowed to be the asset of one private individual. And of course, when oil came along, that template was already there in people's heads. Energy doesn't belong to a private individual. And so their oil was seen as a sort of state asset. In Scotland, we had a different history. Coal was our first energy, and coal belonged to the landowner on whose land it was found. So private ownership was very much the template set up in our country with energy. And oil, well, there was then the divvying up of all the different fields, but it was sold and traded, and there wasn't this idea that it was a community asset, because it had never started that way for us. And we need to know these things, because actually what's happened in Scotland is not the way everybody else has experienced life, and that is actually a big contributor to the success of our neighbours, like Norway. But okay, that's one option for Scotland as an independent country. Then we go for the halfway house, we go for EFTA, we don't become fully EU members, and we knock about with the Icelanders and the Norwegians. It's not a bad one. The other option, if you look at full EU membership, actually that's pretty tasty as well. When I was talking about the guys who decided not to become full EU members, you could see one word dominating the entire thing, and it is fish. If you've got fish, you're in the EU. And the other word that really dictates why you would be in the EU as a Nordic country is Russia. I think it was Riddoch Kennedy was quoting Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian Premier, when he said that being in Scotland was like being in bed with an elephant. And he wasn't trying to be unpleasant about our southern cousins, he was just talking about a size. 60 million people move in the bed, the wee ones kind of just get squashed. And he was talking about Canada and America have got the same relationship. Well, if we are in bed with an elephant, the folk in Finland are in bed with a stegosaurus. Because Russia is right cheek to jowl. You may know that there's been 2 wars fought in the last century to regain land in Karelia, which the Finns lost. There's no love lost still in some respects there, but through the whole experience the Finns have learned to become a truly neutral country. They have to. There's a stegosaurus over there. And what does that mean? It means that the Finns have a constitutional bar on being members of NATO. That is so that they're basically saying to the Russians, you didn't need to invade, there will never ever be an American base on Finnish soil. And the Swedes are the same. They have a constitutional bar. And so the whole of Baltic politics is very influenced by the presence of Russia. So where does their foreign policy and their security come from? It comes from membership of the EU. And that's the largest driver in their wanting to be big fans and members of the EU. They're the only Nordic country that's in the Euro. So they are big believers. The Swedes were pretty sceptical about the EU. They didn't join when everybody else did. And there was one reason why. They have the highest standards of welfare provision in the world. And they thought pretty well that if they joined the EU, all their standards would drop. Now this is quite an extraordinary thing because for us it's exactly the opposite. Most of us, I mean people who are again old enough will remember the days of Thatcher, the only thing that seemed to stand up to Thatcher and her thinking a lot of the time was actually the EU. The Working Time Directive was the first thing that gave overtime to lots of Scots. And every time I've mentioned this in the audience, someone comes up at the end and says, that was me, I got overtime for the first time as soon as that was passed. And that seemed to describe a hugely different approach to the horrible, devil take the hindmost kind of capitalism that Thatcher was pushing through. This was a different social democratic kind of outlook. You didn't just thrash people to death in the workplace. There had to be limits. There had to be rules. So I think for a lot of Scots who were alive at the time, I think that's what gave a lot of us our sort of almost knee-jerk fondness for Europe, for the EU, because it seemed decent. It seemed to have standards that chimed with what we would like ourselves. So consider that those standards that we look up to and think, whoa, the gold standards, the standards that, for example, gave maternity and paternity rules here because the EU basically kicked the British arse until they came up with something that complied with their protocols. The same standards that mean that Scotland has the best water and air quality in Britain, and that's not saying much. All of those were considered too low by Sweden. And that tells you something about the kind of incredible power there is in the Swedish state, because they were really doubtful about being dumbed down by standards we regarded as almost utopian. But by the 1980s, their economy was starting to wobble, the Berlin Wall had come down, they began to think that trying to have socialism in one country-ish wasn't really going to solve the world's problems. They realised they were going to have to get engaged again, so they joined the EU through gritted teeth. And some of you may not know that you actually do know the current Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden. She's a woman called Isabella Lövin, and she had a picture of herself taken with signing an executive order with all her female ministers behind her. Do you remember? When President Trump had that one with all the guys? That was the riposte. And what was she actually riposting with? What was she signing? Well, she was actually recommitting Sweden to raising their standards in the fight against climate change and global warming. Now again, I can say that as a sentence, that is gobsmacking. The proportion of renewable energy in the whole energy mix in Sweden is 62%. The proportion of renewable energy in the energy mix in Britain is 4%. And that is despite a 100% renewable electricity contribution from Scotland. That's how low it is. If you looked across 28 European countries, the only countries with less renewable energy in their mix are Malta and Luxembourg, maybe South Sudan. So that's what I'm trying to get over here. The Swedes are already practically the most renewably powered society on earth, and they're redoubling their efforts, and there's a reason. What she was saying in that executive order was not just digging Donald Trump up with a footy. She was saying, we basically must accept that the United States is absent in terms of thought leadership for the rest of this decade. And if we are not going to let huge problems like climate change, migration, all these big crises just run out of control, then what forum is placed to tackle it? And she's saying it's the EU, it has to be the EU that tackles this. So Sweden are in there running and jumping, trying to get the EU to buckle up and to redouble its efforts to create a different kind of society. So that's kind of attractive. And then we've got the Danes. The Danes joined in 1973. They've never been hugely pro the EU. They've actually had more referendums on aspects of EU policy than any country but Ireland. By God, the Irish know how to do referendums. But they're still there. And after Brexit, there were so many confident predictions that country after country would follow Britain out. And they didn't. A single one of them did. Even those that had really substantial UKIP-y horrible kind of parties there, even those that had big right-wing racist parties as members of their parliament, they didn't follow Britain because nobody will follow Britain because it's crazy. So there you are, as another possible future for Scotland as an independent country. There's another possibility within the EU. Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Scotland. That's quite a back four. And again, that's the kind of societies we should be rubbing shoulders with. Societies that have got very high standards. We are getting into the season where we'll congratulate ourselves a lot. We creep into January, the burns will all be coming flowing out. We'll be talking about a man's a man for all that, to Rod Jock Tamsin's bairns. All those ideas about communitarianism will be spouted again. Do you know, I want to create that society outside my head before I die. It's not enough to have it inside you, we need it outside us. Or all the problems we've gone through in our lives just get trailed through for our kids. And these countries have managed it. And the great thing is, they speak English. If you've actually been to any of the Nordic countries, they speak better English than us. I mean, the Norwegians imported every British sitcom, principally Fawlty Towers and Monty Python, which is a particularly unusual way to learn your English. I was in the very north of Norway and was able to do an entire argument sketch, which is one of the more obscure ones, with a guy in Karasjok, population 2,700. This is in Samiland, right in the very north of Norway. And so actually, that's also why the Norwegians were unsympathetic to Scottish independence. They couldn't see why anybody wanted to divorce Monty Python. I mean, seriously, as serious as that. The British culture is huge for them. Which was the first country to recognise Norwegian independence in 1905? Britain. So, they get it now. I mean, every country in Europe gets it now. They get the difference. Strange the way that life works out. You know, the straightforward referendum just didn't make sense to many people in Europe. But yeah, they get this thing, the difference, the very visible difference of attitude there is towards Europe, they get that. And some of you may know, I was over in Barcelona 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence. Astonishingly enough, on a BBC World programme, seconding one of the Catalan leaders against the Spanish foreign minister and an EU constitutional expert. Now, it was a very interesting debate. But at the end of it, the constitutional expert chappie came up and said, you must understand that we really